For those that don't know me, I'm Henry. I'm the founder and CEO of Yodel One. We've worked with a lot of actually very talented Australian indie developers in the past. The Defiant Studio guys, Defiant Development from Brisbane. We work with them on both mobile and PC titles. So originally it was Ski Safari way back when. And then it was Hand of Fate, which we recently helped them launch in China on the PC side. And then it was Crossy Road with the Hipster Well folks. And most recently, we picked up Rodeo Stampede with the Featherweight guys from GCAP 2 years ago, actually. That's done quite well. OK, there we go. We've got a few more people rolling in. So, as I mentioned, dry topic, hopefully interesting. Let me roll this into presentation mode. First, why do you want to publish a game in China? Right. Some good reasons. 600 million gamers. So probably slightly higher than the population of the US and most of Europe combined. And Australia on top as well. Right. So $25 billion in gaming revenue as of 2016. That's PC plus mobile. But mobile right now takes about half of that revenue on the China side. And up to the end of last year, iOS, right? 31% of App Store's global revenues are actually from the China market as well. So bit of loose change there. If you do it well, you can have a chance at cracking open that pot. Imagine back 5 years, iOS App Store revenue was actually only 3% in China. So phenomenal growth, and it's still growing. That kind of summarizes the contents of this presentation. It's like watching paint dry or watching grass grow. It really depends on your taste. But let me get you started off with some not so exciting stuff. It's what are the major steps in order to get your game reviewed, approved, and licensed for distribution in China. For those of you that have been proactively looking at the Chinese market and investigating or potentially even talking to partners in the Chinese market, many of them will tell you that, hey, there's a process to go through and we can launch your games. Some of them will tell you, no, you don't need to worry about any of that, right? You don't need to be licensed. They both speak the truth. But if you don't have the right licenses and you haven't gone through the right approval processes, you're really limiting your upside because the number of distribution platforms that you can get access to is about 1% of the entire marketplace, right? And also the mechanics with which you can monetize your game and actually hopefully make some return on your investment in getting your game to China is going to be dramatically reduced unless you've gone through the steps of culturalizing it, getting it through the review process, et cetera. There are 3 major steps. The first one is pretty simple if you've got the right partner. The other 2 steps are a little bit more involved. And a lot of it, it's not just red tape. It's also culturalization changes to your game. It's mechanical changes to your game. It's monetization changes to your game that various Chinese review and government review entities will require you to do. So 3 major bureaus in China will be involved in that process. The first, copyright registration. It's owned by an entity called the NCAC. I have no idea what that stands for. I think it's the National something something or other. Okay, the NCAC is the National Copyright. Yep, that's what you need to know. So it's the National Copyright Administration of China, right? So basically, you actually don't get copyrights in Australia, right? So you can't actually obtain a copyright for your game in Australia. Is that correct, or am I wrong? Is Cam Rogers in the audience? Okay, he said he'd come, but Cam's a good friend of mine who's worked with a lot of Australian indie developers to work through the legal processes. But for China, if you want to launch a game, legally, you actually don't need a copyright to launch a game. But commercially, every distribution platform and app store that is local to China requires that you show a copyright certificate to ensure that you own the copyright for that game, right? So you really need to go through the process of obtaining that copyright registration before you can actually distribute. So second is, I'm going to roll the second and third into one big batch. So it's the Ministry of Culture. I don't think you guys have that in Australia. And then it's the SAPPRFT. It's the State Administration of Press, Publishing, Radio, Film, and Television. These are the same guys that review and approve all of the movies, all of the TV episodes that are broadcast in China. So games, film, radio, anything that is digital entertainment or content needs to be reviewed and approved by the SAPPRFT. That, the final step, is the biggest and most involved, okay? So, if you get this wrong, it's gonna look like this. You're gonna spend a lot of money, you're gonna spend a lot of time, and you're gonna make very little of it back, right? So, the example that I quoted before, right? You know, there will be certain parties that will tell you that you don't need to go through this process, you don't need a license, right? We'll just do it for you, right? And you know, what you'll find is that they represent a very, very small segment of the distribution and monetization mechanic for games in the China market. They might be selling Steam codes on Taobao, which is kind of like the eBay of China, right? They may have their own little store that they're trying to sell copies of your game, right? And because they're so insignificant, they kind of fall under the radar of a lot of the government authorities. Anyone that can push any kind of volume will require you to go through these steps and get the licenses. So the first step, copyright registration for Aussie devs. This was provided to me. The left-hand side, do it yourself, right? And the right-hand side, find a partner. The left-hand side, you can actually do it yourself. It's a bit involved, right? But this information was provided to me by Cam Rogers, who's a legal expert that works with a lot of the Victoria and Melbourne area. So he actually went through this process. In order to get your copyright certificate in China and approved by the Chinese government, you first need to get it notarized by a notary public in Australia and have your lawyers basically vow that, yes, you own this copyright for the game, right? Once you got that notarized, you got to take it to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, get them to verify it, and then stamp it. And then once you get that done, you're going to take all of that documentation, which has been verified by the DFAT, and you got to take it to the Chinese consulate in Australia and have them file it and have them then send a copy to the Chinese government in the mainland. Bit of back and forth. I think Cam, it took him about 3 months of to and fro to get through that initial process. So congratulations, after you've done that, you've gone through the easiest part of getting Chinese government approval and licensing for your game. You can work with a local partner, potentially a partner like us or other partners in China. The caveat really is you want to know that you trust this partner, right? Because if you work with this partner and they go through the process of obtaining the copyright for you, they literally own the copyright for your game in the China market. And it's very hard to dispute it because their company name is going to be on the copyright certificate, right? So what we typically do when we work with games developers and help them bring their games into China, we are the publisher of record, right? And we make sure that we work with their lawyers to basically say, anything that we obtain for you in terms of licensing, copyrights, right, we are going to reciprocally transfer those rights back to you once they're approved, right? So there should be, if you're looking to partner with someone to help you through this process, make sure you have 2 sets of documentation, right? One set of legal documents that basically, you know, authorize them to do this inside of the China market, and keep a second set of documents from, you know, have your lawyers draft that up, that basically says anything that you obtain in terms of licenses for this game, including the copyright certificate, including the license number certificates that you get for the game, are transferred back to your company, right? protection on both sides. Okay? And if you are going to authorize a partner to do it, basically, they're the 3 steps. Number 1 is the hardest, right? Finding a partner that you trust. The rest is paperwork. Okay? So, here is a non-exhaustive list of criteria, right, that the Chinese government, particularly the Ministry of Culture and the SAPPRFT, is going to be looking at when they're reviewing your game, right? There are some stuff which is relatively straightforward. There is a lot of stuff that is in gray areas, right? And it's really, really hard to interpret. I'm going to be showing you some examples, so hopefully it's going to help you visualize what some of this stuff looks like, right? So no foreign language, that's pretty straightforward. Any kind of text or voiceovers need to be fully culturalized into Chinese, right? The first time, I mean, we've done it dozens of times now, but the first time we went through this process, we literally got knocked back during the review process because we had hit points, right? HP in the interface, right? It was a game, your character has hit points, right? Sorry, foreign language characters, right? So when you've got for example, an action game, right? And you do a combo, we got combo, right? Sorry, foreign language characters. So everything, right? To be safe, everything needs to be in the Chinese language. No exceptions. Actually, there are, but it's a pain in the ass to get those exceptions through. And I could share a little bit with you about, there are certain games like, for example, if you've got a poker game, right? It's going to be looking really weird if you can't have ace, queen, king, and jack, right, inside a poker game, right? So exceptions can be made for certain game genres and certain mandatory requirements, but you have to go through another process of comprehensively detailing your game mechanics and why these things are required in there, right? And why you cannot change an A to something else. There is no Chinese equivalent of an ace or a jack or a queen, right? That's J, Q, K, and A. So some easy parts like the healthy gaming disclaimer, right? It's basically compliance. There is a certain set of language that you need to display in a prominent area. I will show you some examples. Fairly easy to comply though, right? Any games that have certain game mechanics that like gacha loot drop boxes, right? Anything that the government views as encouraging players to gamble, right? Or to spend money for a chance to get something, requires certain mechanics and restrictions to be put in place for your game. So for example, even something as simple as a, revive in an infinite run game for a chance to catch another monster or animal, etc. Right? If they view that as, well, yeah, you're encouraging people to spend money here, right, for a chance to get something and not an absolute purchase, right, they may ask you to bind how many times people can buy this during a day, right? So they might say, okay, you got to put a cap on it, only 15 purchases of this particular mechanic during a day. They will also, if you use loot drop gacha mechanics in your game, they will also require you to publish the drop rates on your website, right? So for example, we work with Hasbro and Space Ape guys to publish, so we publish and operate Transformers Earth Wars in the China market. And the primary monetization mechanic for that game, it's gacha, right? You buy Transformers crystals, Autobot, Decepticons, you have a chance of getting certain bots. Some are more common, some are rarer. We literally have to publish the exact drop rates for every single crystal that we sell. And we have new crystals, we have to update our drop rates. So a bit different from Western markets whereby, I mean, part of the monetization psychology is people not knowing the drop rates, right? And they do want to, they think they're going to get lucky on the next go and get a really, really rare item or a really rare character, okay? Unfortunately in China, that's not going to work. Everyone's going to know your drop rates. They may still buy a ton load of it, right? But it's more educated. Another simple but mandatory requirement is that every game that has text, especially free-form text that a player can input, you are required by law to include the latest government-approved profanity and keyword filter. And to be honest, it's more about keyword filtering than profanity filtering, but they're pretty common, right? You'll be able to purchase a keyword database filter, incorporate it into your game, and basically it just blocks any offending text from being input or displayed. Okay, so that's the easy stuff, right? All of the second level bullet points here are the really gray area stuff, right? So for example, anything that threatens China's national unity, sovereignty, or territorial integrity. Pretty open to interpretation, right? Anything that harms the nation's reputation, security, or interests, again, pretty open to interpretation, right? So there are no hard rules, but we'll walk you through some examples and best practices of, in general, here's what to avoid, and here's how to replace it with a simpler, or more natural alternative that will more likely than not get you through the review process easier. So certain games are just not going to pass, right? So anything that incites obscenity, drug use, violence, gambling, anything that violates the rights of others or violates the law. Something like Hempire, where the entire game is about growing weed, that's never going to pass approval, right? So games like Grand Theft Auto, going to have really, really hard time getting licensing and approval, right? But, they're the obvious ones. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So for reference, there is a relatively well-written article by this guy. That's his handle, ZhugeX. He's actually an analyst with Nico Partners. It's an analyst firm for the gaming industry. They do a lot of work in China. So they kind of do a really good job at explaining the local market in ways that Westerners understand, right, and can relate to. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in the market, please go and visit his blog and articles. Okay, so the first case study, right, I talked about some of this stuff, but this is a mobile game, Rodeo Stampede. You can't tell because we translated everything into Chinese. But this is what the healthy gaming disclaimer looks like. It's basically these 8 words. All you need to do is put it in a very prominent place at or near the start of the game. So splash screen, perfect place. So every single game that we publish in the Chinese market will have this disclaimer on there. Okay. So gotcha mechanic, right? So when we actually put the game for review process, what you're seeing here is 12 of 15. That's basically we put a daily cap of 15 purchases on a particular IAP because it did use the gotcha mechanic, right? Players are purchasing and buying for a chance to win a certain or capture a certain animal. Okay, so going a little bit deeper, who's heard of the game called Forts? It's a PC game by an Australian developer out of Brisbane. Great game. We just launched it this Saturday in China on Steam. We're going to launch it on a number of other platforms in China over the next couple of months. But when we first looked at the game, we thought, great game, we'd love to work with it. And then as we walked through the campaign, we basically sat down with the developers and said, Nick, we're going to redo all of this shit, right? And there's, some, not by design, but, from the get-go, they pretty much shot themselves in the foot in terms of getting through the review and compliance process. So first, anything that's geopolitically sensitive, right? The game background and the PvE campaign was set US versus Russia versus China. And in the second episode of the PvE campaigns, the Chinese are the bad guys. So, literally, first part of the campaign, it's kind of like the US, and then the bad guys come and it's the Chinese, right? And they look like bad guys, they talk like bad guys, and you're trying to kill them, right? So, yeah, not good if you want to get to Chinese compliance. So what we suggested instead, and what we did for them, we spun up a production team locally and said, okay guys, instead of trying to explain all of this to you, right, there's like 100 little things that need to be fixed, right? So we're just going to do it, and we're going to tell you why we're doing it. Right? So first thing, we fictionalize everything. No real nations, no real factions. and we fictionalize everything. So Russia is now the Winterlands. You know, the Latin America troops are now the tropics, borderlands, desert lands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So turn a real life setting into a fictionalized environment so that there's even no remote risk of an argument that it's going to be geopolitically sensitive, right?
Did they all have, excuse me, did they also have to alter the geographical shape of the territories not to resemble the real countries?
Yes, we did. So we basically redid any of the artwork that represented real life countries and nations. We changed, right? So see the stars on this guy's helmet. We removed that as well, right? So that guy has no stars. So any insignia that would actually designate a particular real life nation as well, right? We either changed or removed it. Right? And obviously, that's going to impact the storyline, the plot, right? So we went and rewrote all of the storyline and narrative as well, right? And sometimes it's the facial expressions as well of the actual character design, right? We went through and modified it. So that took a long time. It probably took about production team of 8 people on our side, about 2 months to kind of just redo everything from text to gameplay design to the PvE campaigns, the artwork and everything, right? And then you put it through the game review process. So end to end, by the way, the 3 big steps that I outlined, end to end, if you know what you're doing and you do it properly, takes about 5 months, right? If you don't know what you're doing and you make mistakes, every time you get kicked back during the last step, that's another 3-week review cycle. So this is kind of like, you know, App Store review 6 years ago when there was not enough people to review apps, right? You'd submit it, and then 3 weeks later you'll hear back, oh, you violated this rule, right? Do it again, and then you get put into the back of the queue. That's what it's like with China review now, right? So obviously App Store review has improved tremendously, right? Now it's a very quick turnaround. But every time you make a small mistake and you have to go back and to the end of the queue and take another 2-3 weeks, that's a long time, right? And you know, most of the time your team's just idling, sitting there, waiting for feedback. Not the best use of resources. Right? Another game, Hand of Fate. Who's heard of Hand of Fate? A lot more people. So great game. Again, you know, the Defiant guys are the ones that actually pulled us into this market because we worked with them really early on when they were doing mobile games, Ski Safari. We published them for them on mobile in China. We got about 300 million downloads in China over the last 5 years, so that's done really well. And they said, Ski Safari's done great. We're going to make some real games now. So they went back to make Hand of Fate. So Hand of Fate did well, did great globally in the Western markets, and they were seeing a lot of interest from Chinese players on Steam, but you know, there was obviously a lot of culturalization issues, and it was kind of like low single digits in terms of sales for China initially. You know, Morgan picked up the phone, gave me a call and said, hey, you guys need to start doing some PC games because we need to get into China with Hand of Fate. So I folded, and we did it. It's done well, so I'll show you some numbers later, but I think since we got Hand of Fate through the China review process and we worked with them to completely culturalize the product, I think last 90 days numbers, China was around about 48.5% of all units sold, Hand of Fate. Yeah, the US was a distant second at 20-something. So I'll show you the exact numbers later in the slides, but yeah, it's worthwhile if you do it properly. And Hand of Fate was not easy. A lot of stuff needed to be changed. I'm actually going to show you a video which kind of summarizes all the stuff just on the 3D models and artwork side that we needed to change, but it was a lot more than that. So yeah, skeletons are prohibited, by the way. Sorry, no skeletons in Chinese games. Anything that exposes bone, pretty much. So yeah, skeletons in general. So, and for Hand of Fate, one of the 4 key races, skeletons. So we literally had to rip an entire race which was a quarter of the game's content out and redo everything, right? So from 3D models to 2D art, fragments of bone in the background of the game, the cards representation that may contain skeletal figures, all of that had to be ripped out and redone, right? So that took quite a bit of time, right? And then obviously the storyline and plot for the skeletal race had to be rewritten as well, okay? Now we're actually working on Hand of Fate 2. So Hand of Fate 2 is about to launch in the next few weeks in Western markets, and then we were actually working in parallel with the Defiant team to get Hand of Fate 2 ready for a China launch on both Steam as well as on Wii Games and other Chinese PC platforms, right? So we knew about skeletons, so we basically said, hey, let's get the skeleton issue fixed before we launch the game, right? But then what about horrific aspects, right? Gory aspects, right? Anything that the review departments view as too horrific or too gory, they'll reject, right? Kick you back, again, another 3-week cycle. So, you know, the Defiant team obviously kind of had a heads up on this, right? So here are the various revs, right? So this, we basically knew that, hey, it's not going to pass review, right? So there are the 3 iterations we went through, right? Removing obvious scar tissues. By the way, the color tone that you use is very important as well. They don't like blood that looks realistic. So in a lot of games, for example, with Sniper 3D is another game that we published and got through the review process. And the major fun in the game is headshots, right? You basically snipe someone from a very long distance, the head explodes, right? Blood is everywhere. How can you make that not gory? So, with great difficulty, right? So, so the blood effects, you got to change the colors. Might become black blood. It might become a white flash as the head explodes, right? But you have to find a way to kind of get through these review requirements while maintaining the fun of the game, right? So for this, what we ended up doing was, you know, 1, 2, 3 revs, and we ended up with this instead. It still looks good, right? But it's just different to what you would want to do in Western markets, right? So now it more looks like, you know, the Stone Man out of Game of Wars rather than a kind of mutated zombie monster, right? So keep a lot of these things in mind. Anything that has realistic blood, realistic gore. I was actually talking to Mario from Pickpock a few months back before Into the Dead 2 launched, and we were talking about, hey, can we do something with it in China? And then I played a build of the game, and I said, dude, I think it's going to do well here, but I don't know even where to start to try to get this through government approval and review, right? Because every aspect, and what's good about the game was really the horror, right? You get into the game, and there is a pulsating sense of horror as you run through the woods, as you get your guts ripped out by a zombie, right? So, I mean, certain games and game genres are just going to be really, really hard to get through the approval process. So, I'm going to show you a quick video. It flashes through the content relatively quickly, so if you don't catch it all, just let me know. I'll pull back through a lot of the content. But this is a summary of a lot of the 3D and 2D art changes that we did for Hand of Fate to get it through the review process. So the skeleton, we basically turn into a wooden golem. So the last 2 you'll see, on the right side was the old art. It was kind of like a bloody pulsating heart and a severed hand, right? Just remember body parts as well as internal organs shown in an explicit way are likely to be rejected as well, right? So going through a lot of those changes, basically, better to be safe than be sorry, right? You know, a lot of times it's about reimagining what you have into something completely different that still vibes with the game. So why we used wooden golems was mainly because of the 3D modeling, right? So we knew that skeletons were prohibited. So what could we create that didn't require us to basically throw out all of the old models and rebuild everything, right? And rebuild all the rigging, animation, et cetera. So we thought wooden golems kind of move like skeletons, right? So we kept the models and riggings, changed the texture, but then we still had to go through all of the 2D artwork and revise it. We still had to rewrite all of the game lore narrative to be around, hey, why, you know, the canon around the wooden golem race versus the skeletal race, right? And why they were competing with the other 4 races, et cetera. So getting it right kind of looks like this, right? As I mentioned before, Hand of Fate's done extremely well in China. That's why we're ramping up to do Hand of Fate 2 earlier rather than later. So for Hand of Fate 1, we actually launched in China almost a year and a half after the game was launched in the Western regions. Initially, it was just Steam, right? So with Hand of Fate 2, we're planning to hopefully simultaneous, but even if not simultaneous launch, at least within 1 to 2 months of launch, right? To make sure that we have the ability to capitalize on the Chinese market much earlier rather than later. So Hand of Fate 2, I mentioned to you before, 48.34% of units sold from China. US is actually lower than I thought. It's 11.26 now. So pricing is a little bit different in China as well. So for example, on Steam, by default, the Chinese market pricing is set to half of what your US market pricing is, right? And then any sales that you do and discounts that you do is on top of that. But even at 50% of the sale price, at 48.34% of the units, you're still looking at a quarter of your revenue coming from China, right? Mobile game, Rodeo Stampede. We've gotten about 100 million downloads for this game worldwide in the last 15 months. Over 50 million from China, right? So again, half your market right there. And I think from a revenue perspective, it's like almost 50% as well. It's high 40% revenue-wise. For a game that grosses 8 digits US dollars per year, it's a big chunk of cash to leave on the table by not doing China properly. Right? And then on the weekend, we launched Forts on Steam in China, so Steam only in China. Launch day, it was a Sunday. 26% of revenue, 42% of units sold, right? And this is competing against the rest of the world, and this was the first discount that Forts had done on Steam after being on the market for 6 months, and there was already a wish list of 120,000 people waiting to buy the game on Steam. So, and China just launched on Sunday and still managed to be the #1 market, right? So, like I said, dry session. Hopefully, there were some takeaways that is going to help you, ease you through the process of moving closer to be able to get your game licensed and monetized and distributed in the China market. And if you do actually reach that goal, the numbers are worthwhile, right? If you do it properly, market it properly, monetize it properly. That's it. That's all I have on this very dry topic. If you want to go into more detail, I actually wrote a 5,000-word article on the actual process of getting through the regulations. Read it. It was dry writing it. I'm sure it'll be even more dry reading it. But hopefully it's helpful. Any questions? It's done awesome.
Yeah, we got to #2.
Uh-huh.
I guess part of the concern about trying to take it in on Android is kind of goes with this regulation process. If you end up signing over the copyright to a local body, it might mean that it will turn up on a Chinese regulated
Yes and no. So it will certainly get on the regulators' radar, right? There's no doubt about that. Because what happens is that as soon as you submit the game for approval to the SAPP RFT, first thing they do is look at, is your game already online? And they'll check the App Store. They're going to check Google Play, right? And they're going to check all of the Western stores to see, is this ticked for distribution in China, right? And then what they'll do is they'll start reviewing your online version rather than the version that's being submitted, okay? Because that, you know, from their perspective, it's, are you submitting me a build that looks different from what you're distributing, right? So yes, it would definitely get on their radar. But that said, though, they typically don't force you to kind of delist that, right? You just won't get through the process, right? You basically will need to make sure that both builds are in sync with all of the compliance and regulatory requirements before they will even review it again. So we've done it before. We've got knocked back, right? Basically, it says that build is different to the build that you're submitting to us, right? We are a bit smarter than that, so you know, make sure all of the changes are on your iOS build before resubmitting it for review. Please.
Do you usually provide like language options for like Chinese and stuff like that? So you have Chinese in the game. Do you have access to like English in China or like other languages? Like has options?
So depending on the kind of game, you know, we typically make it easy, so we geo-detect, right? So when you start up the game, we geo-detect what language your device is, which country you're in, and then we default to hopefully the right language that matches your location. And then there will be option within the settings menu whereby you can switch to another language, right? But from a government review process perspective, they don't care about your other languages. All they want to look at is your Chinese build, and what does that look like? Is that in compliance? So a lot of times, for example, if you play Forts or Hand of Fate in China versus outside of China, content's actually going to be different. So at startup, we geo-detect and we switch to the different models, right? So the Chinese version, wood golems. The Western versions, skeletons, right?
So with that, do you actually, like, does that build then have both versions in there?
Yes.
So if someone does change it from Chinese to English,
Yes,
like
it'll be different.
that's different. It's all fine to do that as well? Like,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, only a very small fraction of your player base is going to do that, right? So, for example, you know, when you're playing a game, very rarely you're going to switch it to Chinese, right? Because you probably don't understand the language, right? Same applies to Chinese people that, you know, I'd rather play the game in local language, right? With localized script, localized lore, localized voiceovers, et cetera. There are a fraction of people that will do that, but if they do that, they're kind of used to, you know, the differences they're going to see anyway. So, I mean, with Hand of Fate, we took it as far as redoing all of the voice acting as well. So the Chinese version actually has Chinese voice actors for all of the VO inside of the game. And the storyline and canon is slightly different from the English version. It's been culturalized, so it's more relevant to the Chinese gamer. Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman in the red.
Hey, so just on the other, the foreign language depiction and text, does that extend into in-game content and texture maps as well? And is there any wiggle room?
No, it's really what's visible to the player. So I think the question was, does the foreign language restrictions apply to kind of the internal pipeline of the game? Is that correct?
No, I mean, for example, if your game environment, your in-game 3D models you're depicting
Oh.
the US or Paris or, you know, Berlin or somewhere like that, where you have street signs in that language or brand.
Yeah, it does apply. Sorry. Yeah. You may be able to get away with it, right? But, you know, the cost of risking that is 3 weeks, right? So another review cycle. And you may have to go back and fix it anyway. So, I mean, there are easy ways to do that. If it's really obvious, you know, you can kind of just like blur out the text so that, or make it incomplete, right? So there are certain treatments that you can do so that it can fall under the radar and get through approvals. But typically, it's anything that is visible to the player. It's restricted from a language perspective. Yes, another question.
Just wonder with multiplayer, are there any restrictions on Chinese players and non-Chinese players linking together, particularly if they're super
Yes.
versions of the game?
Absolutely. Good question. So this is there's a lot of stuff, right? I've scratched the surface with you guys today. There's actually a lot of restrictions about multiplayer games. What the government classifies as online games, right? Anything that is an online game, which means you're connected, requires a strong internet connection. Two, you can play versus other players, is actually subject to a whole other set of review criteria. There is a system and a bunch of mechanics called the healthy gaming, regulation in China. If you played the Chinese version of League of Legends on mobile, it's called Arena of Kings, is I think what Tencent calls it now. If you play the Chinese version and you're online for more than 2 hours, you start getting pop-ups that says, you've now been playing this game for over 2 hours, take a break. Right? You play for another hour, they start forcing you to go offline, right? They force you to take a 5-minute break. You play for 8 hours, they literally kick you off and said, next time you can log back in is so-and-so time, right? And you can't get into the game. So there's actually a lot of regulations about connected gameplay in China. You will need to add and inject all of these systems into your game in order to get a so-called online game through the review process. If your game has an online mode, but it's not the main mode, right? There is some wiggle room in terms of investing in adding all of the online game control mechanics. Does that kind of answer your question or not?
Are there any restrictions between allowing non-Chinese players and Chinese players in the same sort of server? And
Not really. Not really. I mean, they don't explicitly say that Chinese players can't play against Western players or foreign players. But from a technical perspective, trying to achieve that is you're going to have to build either a tunnel in or a tunnel out, right? So they don't have a lot of regulations around that from a review perspective, because from a technological perspective, there's a lot of challenges and barriers. Right? For example, the Great Firewall of China, right, will randomly start intercepting and making you drop packets as soon as you traverse outside, right? So if you've got a game that requires a strong connection between someone in China and someone in Australia, they're going to have an awful game experience, right? You're talking about 480 millisecond lag times on the good side, right? And all of a sudden they'll drop. They don't know why, right? So you're gonna need to be able to overcome that technical aspect of the challenge, right? Obviously, if these people are able to converse inside of your game, right, in-game chat, etc., that you'll need to comply, right? Keyword filters, profanity filters. So we typically disable any kind of free text input during the review process, right? Because they will catch it, right? And simple things like letting players put their portrait for their avatar and headshot, big no-no, right? Letting them do free-form names, right? Everything needs to go through the keyword and profanity filter, right? So yeah, the review process, the guys that do the game reviews, they're pretty draconian about catching stuff like that, because I mean, imagine letting someone upload their portrait for their avatar or headshot. They can upload anything. It could be porn, it could be something offensive, it could be whatever, right? So it'll just get rejected if you have that. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, is there a separate review process when we do content updates?
For content updates? A good question. There is, but there isn't. So the onus really is on you, right? Because of the pure volume of games going through the review process, right? They don't require regular updates and reviews, right? But the onus is on the publisher and developer to ensure that if there is a major content change, you have to submit it, right? If you don't and you get caught, right, you get delisted pretty much. So what we try to do is, you know, if you had to go through the review process for every content update, you're not going to update your game with any regularity, right? So it's a 5-month cycle for every review process. So what we do is we kind of set the framework, right? And the biggest hurdle is the initial review. When you get approved, you get a number of certificates. You get your copyright certificate, you get your Ministry of Culture filing number, and then you get what they call an ISDN number, right? So if you buy a book, there's an ISDN number on every book, right? You get one of those, right? That basically denotes that, hey, this is an authorized game for the Chinese market. And every time you distribute your game through an app store or a distribution platform, you have to provide all of that as part of the App Store metadata, right? And so when you update your game, stay within the framework, right? If you get creative and try to sneak something in that is obviously against the regulations, the app stores will either catch you, or if a player or a competitor reports your game as having offending content, right, then that's when they go back and look at it and say, sorry guys, you know, you're being delisted. So, any other questions? No? Thank you for coming to such a dry talk. I hope it was at least informative. And I mean, if you're interested in getting into the China market, whether it's mobile or PC games, please come and talk with us. We've actually got a booth down the way. It's right next to the coffee booth, so we're very well positioned. So if you're either going to grab a cup of coffee or you want to talk about the China market or global publishing, please come and grab us. Thank you very much. Oh, one more thing. I did promise you that I'd tell you about how to, if your game really requires English language inside to operate, right, there are ways to get it through, right? So we work with a game called HRM, Human Resources Machine, to get them through the Chinese review and approval. You know, the core mechanic in Human Resource Machine is, you know, you're really a programmer, right? So it's the copy to commands, copy from commands. I mean, how do you replace that, right? It's machine language, but it's represented as English letters, right? So we actually had to write an entire separate set of justifications. We had to define all of the English language commands that were going to appear in the game, and then kind of have a Chinese definition for all of these, and basically say, symbolically, copy to means this and has this function in the game, right? It does prolong the review process, but you can get it through if it's, you know, an absolute mandatory part of the core gameplay. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.